Good evening, everyone. It's Wednesday, September 2nd, and it's 6:30 in the evening, and it's Formation Hour here at Church of the Redeemer, and we're on the Church of the Redeemer digital campus coming to you uh, via via a Mac computer. And tonight, I've invited Angela Ward, another staff member with me here at Redeemer, to join me on this topic. And uh, she'll say a little bit about this herself, but I have to tell you that we've enjoyed the research doing this, and I've learned so much, and I suspect she has too. But our title this evening is Suffragists, Sexism, and Silence, the Great Movement to Win the Vote. And what spurred my interest in doing this particular presentation was that on August 20th, which just a few days ago, Americans commemorated the 100th anniversary of the adoption of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was in 1920. And the 19th Amendment is short and very simply worded. I'm going to read it. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. What is not short or simple, however, is the 75-year movement that led to the adoption in 1920 of the 19th Amendment. That movement to win the vote required the perseverance of 3 generations or perhaps more of women, those who supported them, and to be realistic, it was a very bumpy road and there were many setbacks and backs and forths along the way. I've asked Angela, particularly tonight, to join me in this conversational presentation because she grew up in England, and England had a parallel movement to win the vote for women. So we'll kind of join in a conversation about these two movements together tonight. We've titled our effort Suffragists, Sexism, and Silence because 75 years is a substantial historical time frame. And we can only touch on the lives of a few of the thousands of women who fought the fight, and they were called the suffragists. Along with the right or the battle to get the vote, we're going to highlight some other forms of sexism which supported the denial of the right to vote, and then toward the end talk briefly about the silence, the seeming silence of the church during these 75 years. So Angela, would you like to start?
I would love to. Of course, as we were mentioning before, this, in my mind, because of the duration of what I think about as sort of the start of any kind of legal system in the United Kingdom or in the various parts of Great Britain, goes back probably to, for argument's sake, to the Magna Carta in 1215, because nobody really had any rights much at all until that sort of, you could almost basic start, and all through, and of course the church had a lot of power, the Roman Catholic Church, and then the split from the Catholics, and then various political battles throughout England during the time when things became from an agrarian community into much more of a mechanistic age with the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. And so men, of course, didn't have that many rights either, but it was very, very gradually evolving. But it's interesting that it all sort of really came into being with women, particularly in the beginning of the 19th century, as you might say. And in England, there were various acts that the church, for instance, had an act in 1818 which allowed some women to vote just in parish elections. But the person that I have found, I could be wrong, but the one who seems to have really, really started the effort in England was Mary Smith in 1832.
Now, do we have a photo of her?
We do somewhere.
We do?
I'm
okay.
afraid they got a bit.
We're going to try photos tonight. So as we do this, we ask for your prayers.
Actually, I'm not sure that we found one for Mary Smith.
We're going to go through them.
So Actually, I'm not sure that we did have one in the end.
Okay.
For Mary, but she was a young woman from
Alrighty.
Yorkshire. She petitioned her local MP, and she felt that other spinsters should, quote, have a voice in the election of members, being members of
Yeah.
Parliament, of course. She said that she paid taxes and she was subject to the laws of the land, and, therefore they should vote. Quite a few years later, John Stuart Mill, the famous philosopher, who
Very
was
famous,
also
yeah.
an MP, presented a women's suffrage petition to the Commons, which actually contained over 1,500 signatures.
House of Commons.
Yeah, the House of
That's
Commons. That was laughed out of, actually literally laughed out of the Commons. Then the Manchester National Society for Women's Suffrage was formed. Around that time, Manchester being, of course, up in the northern part of England. Then in 1872, it became official, one could say, because the National Society for Women's Suffrage was formed, and later the more influential National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. And all over England at this time, there was a sort of sprouting of these societies. I don't know exactly how that fits in with your timeline, but I would say it was fairly concurrent. And then through the years, these societies, according to the British Library, were just propping up all over the country. In 1870, married women were given the right to own their own property and money, which sounds ridiculous, but it's
It's the same in the American experience.
a big step forward. And then in 1894, the Local Government Act was passed, allowing married and single women to vote in elections for county and borough councils, which would be like local elections here.
Yeah.
And then in 1897, 17 different societies united to form the National Society for Women's Suffrage. And this was led by Millicent Fawcett, who was very, very involved. And
We have a photo of her or not?
No.
Okay.
And then she got this really started, and for about 6 years, they had started to really petition and make themselves very vocal. But it was very peaceful at that time. I mean, interestingly enough, there were people against suffrage who didn't necessarily feel that women had to stay in the home, that they couldn't be outside the home to work, but they felt that women shouldn't be involved in the grubby, that's a quote, grubby world of politics, because
And money making.
it undermined the women's sort of compassion and their focus on
We're going to hear about that in the American experience.
what was
as well.
going on in the world, and helping to feed the poor and generally improve things that way. And then when it really got brutal, as one might say, when it was in 1903, and we do have a picture of Emmeline Penkhurst, who I think, and that's her actually being arrested at one point.
Is that her?
That's Emmeline
Okay.
Penkhurst.
Do we have another one of her?
There was another one of
Okay,
her.
we'll find.
There she is.
There she is. Okay.
And she was a very interesting woman. She was married to an older man who had been a friend of John Stuart Mill. So, of course, and she had grown up in a household with people who were quite politically interested and involved. And so she decided that all this peaceful activity just wasn't going to work. So she said that it had to be deeds, not words. And at that point, it became a real sort of battle, literally.
Yeah.
And women became much more vocal and involved. At the same time, around the same time, I think it was 1902, women textile workers from the north of England, which was primarily Lancashire and Yorkshire, which were the two big, wool and cotton.
Now, where would that be in relation to London?
That's about a 2 or 3 hour train ride.
North?
North, yes.
Okay.
And so they presented a petition to Parliament that contained 37,000 signatures demanding votes for women. And as I said, under the rally cry of deeds, not words, Emmeline became much more aggressive in her thinking, and they did some pretty bad things. They set fire to some churches. They threw rocks at members of Parliament. One of them threw an axe at the Prime Minister, which narrowly missed him. It apparently fell in a carriage that was nearby and wounded somebody. They just really made them. They marched a lot.
Mm-hmm.
They sent out petitions, and always with this one aim. They chained themselves to Emily Davison, who I will talk about a bit more later on, who was very famous for another reason. She decided that if she wasn't going to be in the census of 1911, that she felt that she wasn't a person because she wasn't allowed to vote. So why would they bother to count her? She actually hid in the House of Commons, apparently. I don't know how she pulled that off, but she did. And so this was all going on. Women formed a league in 1909 whose members refused to pay any taxes without political representation. Right. No vote, no tax. Then, interestingly, that next year, the Women's Anti-Suffrage League merged with the Men's National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage, and the league then had 42,000 members.
Wow!
So they certainly were agitating against them as well. I mean, our suffragettes, as they called them in England, were agitating against the men. And interestingly, Sir Henry Dalton, who was part of the famous Royal Dalton Pottery, was against women working because he felt that it made men, quote, indolent.
Indolent.
Unquote. Which I thought was quite funny. But anyway, this was all going on. And then in 1910, 11, and 12, there were 3 conciliation acts passed that would, just for that reason, to try to conciliate for the women. And they decided that they would extend the right of women to vote in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Ireland, which would have been about 1.5 million women. But they didn't succeed with those either. So during this time, women were beaten, arrested, imprisoned, force-fed, generally mistreated. One of the suffragists, arrested many times, had her cell flooded by ice cold water. And
waterboarded.
Yeah, and apparently had to hang on for grim life, so according to what I read. Emmeline Penkhurst had 3 daughters, only 2 of whom were involved in any kind of political activity. Christabel was very famous. She actually became a Dame of the British Empire at some point. And there was Annie Kenny.
I've heard that name.
Annie Kenny, and then Emily Wilding Davison. I don't know if you'd like to just run a few of the pictures just so that people can see. I don't necessarily have names for them.
Do we know who she is?
No, that's one of the Americans.
Okay, yeah, these are Americans.
This is an interesting poster from the period showing them that they're not allowed to vote, and that, interestingly enough, some nice poster art arose out of this whole situation. Yeah. There's some of our women on the march. They all wore white a lot, as you notice.
Do we know why that was? They did it in America too.
Yes, I'm not sure whether they just to show that they were just sort of blank canvases. I'm not sure.
Look at that! That's great.
There's. I love this one, and there was another one somewhere we saw where she's obviously lifted off.
She's lifted off her feet.
Yeah, and it's all very formally dressed as well. Of course, it must have been such a burden, especially when they were thrown into prison. Emily Wilding Davison was very interesting. She was among the many who were arrested, and
is that her?
Yes, that could well be
Okay.
she. I'm not positive.
It's two English bobbies there.
And I mean, holding, and she doesn't. She looks quite frail, doesn't she?
Yeah.
Emily quoted or misquoted, "Rebellion against tyrants is obedience to God." That was her thing. She was arrested 9 times. She went on hunger strikes 7 times. She was force-fed 49 times.
Unbelievable.
And at one point, the British government passed an act that became known as the Catlin Mouse Act because they would let these poor souls out of prison to recuperate, and then they could arrest them again, so that it looked as if they were being really quite kind to them, and then they would start this nasty process all over again, whereby they would force feed them and pour water in their cells and horrible things like that.
Yeah.
And she was a very bright young woman and had attended classes at Oxford, but had been denied a degree as she was female. And she finally walked out onto the racetrack at the British Derby in Epsom in 1913 and was struck by the King's horse and died 4 days later. Some called her a martyr for the cause, and some just said that she was just a nasty, unpleasant, divisive character. And there's quite a gruesome footnote to this. It's very sad because apparently the jockey of the King's horse, the jockey's name was Herbert Jones, he actually attended Emmeline Penkhurst's funeral in 1928 and laid a wreath in honour of both Emmeline and Emily Wilding Davison. And apparently he was haunted by, quote, that poor woman's face. And in 1951, he hanged himself.
Oh, gosh.
So it's a very tragic
It is.
footnote to the whole attempt to secure the vote. A woman I could only identify her as Miss Nell, followed by a nurse whose name was Olivia Smith, chained themselves to the railings outside Downing Street and spent 3 weeks in jail. The Conciliation Acts, as I said, were passed. In 1913, 50,000 people from around the United Kingdom took part in the pilgrimage for women's suffrage with a rally in Hyde Park. 1914, Emmeline attempted to present a petition to King George V outside of Buckingham Palace, but the irony almost is that due to a huge period of time of great aggression, which was, of course, the First World War, the women decided that they would not continue their attempts to agitate for the vote, and decided that they would insert themselves into the war effort, which they did. And during this time, apparently 5 million women almost were actually working in Britain in, I suppose, munitions factories and whatever, and earned the respect of Prime Minister Asquith and his successor, who was Lloyd George, another Liberal MP. And so in about 1918, the Representation of the People Law was passed, allowing women over the age of 30 and men over the age of 21 to vote. Women had to be married to or a member of the local government register. In 1919, Nancy Astor became the first woman MP, later very famous Lady Astor, who made some quite acerbic quotes. And on the 2nd of July 1928, the Representation of the People Act finally entitled everyone over the age of 21 to vote. And sadly, this law passed 18 days before Emmeline Penkhurst died, so she never actually saw it come to fruition, although she must have had a good idea by then that it would be law.
Yeah. So what year was this?
That was 1928.
28. Okay, that's about 8 years later than our experience.
And that, of course, was for everybody, though there weren't
Yeah.
any exclusions such as there were
Here,
really.
race,
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to come back. We're going to come back over the pond now to the United States, and as I said, on August 20th was the official 100th anniversary of the approval of the by 3/4 of the states of the 19th Amendment and giving the vote to women. And as a run-up to this anniversary, there's been a great effort in publishing books and magazine articles, and there's newspaper reports, special films and videos, and all kinds of internet sites and social media and so on. So there's a wealth of information on this topic in the United States, and as you just heard, in England as well. And there's going to be more published in the coming years. So what we're trying to do tonight is kind of offer you food's on my mind, so I haven't eaten supper yet. So anyway, her presentation and mine and the conversation along with it, we want you to think of them as two appetizers of the great movements. And so we would ask you now, after this presentation tonight, to taste and savor one or more of the dishes from this historical buffet of women winning the right. It's a great story. And just as a footnote, if you don't know where to start in terms of the United States story, I suggest you do some research, get a book, magazine, internet, and so forth. There's a lot of information on the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment, which was Tennessee. And with the Tennessee approval, 3/4 of the states had approved it and it became law. But what happened in Tennessee is another great story. So, in terms of the United States and our suffragist movement, there were thousands of women and many men as well who fought for the right to vote for women. And I'm going to just highlight 3 tonight. They are known for their efforts. All 3 are known for their efforts. You may not have heard of 2 of them, but you will certainly have heard of the first one, and the one you cannot leave out. And that is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And we're going to bring up one or more photos of her. There she is in old age on the right, or at least it's on the right on my screen. And next to her in the darker dress is Susan B. Anthony. And they were collaborators for many, many years on this effort. That's a picture in old age. There's one of Cady Stanton with one of her many children, and that's in 1857, just a few years after what I'm about to talk about. And we're going to get another picture of her. There she is in a younger time with Susan B. Anthony as well. And you can kind of tell from her demeanor that she's got plenty to say. So it was said of Luciano Pavarotti, the great opera singer, that his voice was one that comes around only once in 100 years. And I would argue that Cady Stanton, in terms of the women's movement, is the same kind of character who was there at the right time with the right skills and the right perseverance to make something happen. She was exactly what the movement needed. Stanton came from an affluent background, and it was said, this was an interesting fact I found, it was said that as a girl, she read her lawyer father's law books.
Interesting. Very.
She and a few other women, all of whom were fed up with what they called, at an early July 1848 gathering together, they were talking about the wrongs to women. So they planned and pulled off the first women's rights convention, which was held in Seneca Falls, New York, July 19 and 20 in the year 1848. And I've been there to the Women's Museum, Suffrage Museum there. And at that gathering, as she later recalled in her autobiography, and I quote her, "I poured out that day the torrent of my long accumulating discontent. with such vehemence and indignation that I stirred myself, as well as the rest of the party, to do and dare anything. She, at this time, in 1848, she was just 32 years old. She drafted the manifesto for the convention, and at that convention there were 300 women and men. 68 of the women and 32 of the men signed a Declaration of Sentiments, which she had drafted. And the Declaration of Sentiments of 1848 was patterned after our own Declaration of Independence of 1776. And I invite you to go on the internet and type in your search engine the Declaration of Sentiments of 1848, and you'll find some very interesting reading. I want, in this presentation, I want to read you some of those grievances in this declaration. They also address the second word in our presentation title, which is sexism of that time, and it continued even leading up to the adoption of the 19th Amendment in 1920 and past that. Sexism, in terms of the suffragist movement, we can simply define as discrimination against women.
Exactly.
So exactly. So let me read some of this to you. This is great stuff. Now remember, they're patterning the Sentiments Declaration after our own Declaration of Independence. And here's a line right away. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal.
Yes, I've heard that one before.
And here we go. The history of mankind, as this document says, is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. He has withheld from her rights which are given to most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners, having deprived her of this first right as a citizen, the elective franchise, thereby leaving her without representation in the halls of legislation. He has oppressed her on all sides. He has made her, if married in the eye of the law, civilly dead. He has taken from her all right in property, even to the wages she earns. He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband. In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming, to all intents and purposes, her master.
Now, exactly when was this, Father Ralph?
1848.
Okay, so it's interesting, yes, and like I said before, it was 1870 when married women in England were given the right to own their own property and money.
So in 1848, there had been this.
Yeah, so it's interesting.
He has so framed the laws of divorce as to what shall be the proper causes of divorce. In case of separation, to whom the guardianship of the children shall be given, it went to the husband, as to be wholly regardless of the happiness of women. After depriving her of all rights as a married woman, if single and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable to it. He has monopolized nearly all the profitable employments, and from these she is permitted to follow. She receives but a scanty remuneration.
Right.
He allows her in church as well as state, but in a subordinate position, claiming apostolic authority for her exclusion from the ministry, and with some exceptions from any public participation in the affairs of the church. I don't know about the Church of England. But...
Well, the Vestries Act, what did I say, 1818, did allow some women to vote in parish elections, but it was all very spotty, I think.
Okay. He has created a false public sentiment by giving to the world a different code of morals for men and women, by which moral delinquencies, which exclude women from society, are not only tolerated, but deemed of little account in man. He has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself, claiming it as his right to assign for her a sphere of action when that belongs to her conscience and to her God. And it goes on for a while. So you get the tenor of this. Okay, wrongs to women is what it's about. Now, the convention used this Declaration of Independence, 1776, as a model because it was very effective. And because some of those who attended that convention in 1848 would have been alive still, would have been alive at the time of the founding of the United States in the late 18th century. The Declaration of Independence was fresh, in a sense, in their minds.
And I read somewhere actually that in America, actually, that women were not expressly disallowed to vote until the beginning of the 19th century. So there was that little period of time after 1776.
Yeah. Small window.
And the same in England. It was like 1832 before
Yeah.
they definitely banned them from it. So they had that window, but they didn't really know they had it, which is very interesting too.
Yeah, and her husband might not have let them know it.
That's true too.
So this Declaration of Sentiments, 1848, I think became kind of the enduring platform for the suffrage movement for the next 75 years. Stanton never wavered from her view that the most important grievance was that women did not have the right to vote, because with the right to vote, most of the other grievances could be confronted and corrected through the political process. The right to vote was basic and key. So that's Elizabeth Cady Stanton. There are many, many photographs of her. She wrote an autobiography. She wrote a commentary on the Bible, and is quite famous. The second suffragist in the United States I want to comment on is Mary Church Terrell, an African American. Now, I don't have the photo downloaded on the laptop here, but what I do have, I can show you a picture from my iPhone. I'll just put that up there for a minute. You can tell by the way she's dressed and the way she's staged that she's a person of means.
Yes, this beautiful dress,
Yeah,
the lace work.
Yeah, you can tell that. I said she was an African American. She was very light skinned, which at that time helped her, I think, in her efforts. She had grown up as the child of former slave parents in Memphis, Tennessee. And her father had, after emancipation, had made a lot of money in real estate. He became the first African-American millionaire in the South. And
interesting.
some of you may remember I did a presentation on the martyrs of Memphis, the yellow fever pandemic in 1878. Well, as a result of that yellow fever driving people out of Memphis, the city became depopulated for a number of years. And that's when her father went in and bought all this property. That's how he became
very enterprising.
A millionaire.
Yeah.
They were her parents were prominent members of the black elite of Memphis during the Reconstruction era, and she received the best possible education available to young women at the time, notwithstanding her race. She went to private schools in Ohio. Now, I've chosen her to highlight because she used her position to draw attention to the conditions of African American women and to push the white suffragists to include African American women in the suffrage movement, which they did for a time. In 1898, she addressed the National American Women's Suffrage Association convention, and I'm going to quote her, "Not only because they are women, but because they are colored women, are discouraged and disappointed at every turn. And yet the progress made by colored women has never been surpassed by that of any people in the history of the world." Well, there's a little hyperbole there, but you can tell how strong her feeling is. For much of history, the demands for women's suffrage and black suffrage were bound together. And that was because the initial leaders of the suffrage movement prior to the Civil War were involved in the abolitionist and black suffragist movements. I think Terrell's advocacy was necessary because in the post-Reconstruction years, that's the last years of the 19th century, that bond between white and black suffragists was broken.
I suppose you could almost say that Angelina Grimke, who had lived quite a few years before that, but she was very involved in the abolition of slavery, wasn't she? And so she was really an important part of that too, although we don't hear very much about her.
No, you don't. And she's not one I chose to. The mainstream white suffragists excluded black women. White supremacy, exemplified in what we call here the Jim Crow laws, which we're all familiar with, took over, as it did in other organizations and governments for decades. The last thing I want to do is just quote her again. How can anyone who is able to use reason and who believes in dealing out justice to all God's creatures think it is right to withhold from one half the human race rights and privileges freely accorded to the other half, which is neither more deserving nor more capable of exercising them? Okay, she's right on. The third suffragist, and she's coming later into the 20th century, is Alice Paul. I have a picture of her on my iPhone as well. I'll put that up there for a minute. Now, if you look carefully at that, there's something about her demeanor which tells you all you need to know.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier, didn't we?
Yeah.
When we were discussing things.
She has a look in her eye that...
And many of them had that same "I dare you" sort of look.
Yeah, exactly.
Face.
That's well put. I dare you. She was born in 1885, so she's coming later in the movement's years, to a wealthy New Jersey family who were Quakers. She comes from that background. She was educated at Swarthmore College, and she earned at that, which was very unusual at the time, a PhD in political science at the University of Pennsylvania.
So she's right along there with Emily Wilding Davison, who was born in 1872. So
they're close.
Yes.
Here's the interesting part for you, I think. In 1907, Alice Paul went to London, where she served an apprenticeship to Emmeline Penkhurst.
And yes, and Emmeline Penkhurst came here in...
Oh, did she?
Yes, in 1913,
Okay.
And again in the 20s, I believe, and maybe even Christabel too, her daughter.
Okay.
So it's possible, though we don't know it, that they actually met. What she would have done if she had that apprenticeship. That is interesting.
And when she went to London, she learned the ways of the English suffragists. And by the time she came back to the United States 3 years later in 1910, she had experienced something you already touched on: arrests, a brutal imprisonment, and a gruesome month-long hunger strike.
Yes.
Paul learned in England, and I'm quoting from a source, to deploy public demonstrations for maximum popular attention and to hold the political party in power responsible for inaction on the women's call for the vote.
We had some pictures of quite a couple of pictures of gatherings somewhere, I believe, that involved many people.
Well, that's one we looked at, and there she is.
And then...
Oh, there's mass arrest.
Yes, and then there.
There we go.
Huge.
Well, look at the people I wonder where that was taken.
That was somewhere I think in northern London.
Okay, because it could have been in Washington, D.C., which I'm going to talk about in a minute.
I think that was from the British Archives, but but it could have been. It's hard to identify.
Well, there she is again.
Yeah.
Right on. Fight on. God will.
Fight on, and God
will give something.
Give
victory.
Give something.
Victory, I think.
Give them victory, or give us. Yeah.
So let's go back here. Because the movement had waned a bit during the Reconstruction period, she wanted to revive it. And she wanted to revive it by the introduction of an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So She organized a demonstration in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd, 1913. Excuse me, I have to have a drink. And March 3rd, 1913 was the day before the inauguration of the newly elected president, Woodrow Wilson. The parade attracted thousands. They said, I think the spectators in Washington on Pennsylvania Avenue were 20 deep on each side. When Wilson stepped off the train in Washington, D.C., coming from his home in New Jersey, arriving for his inaugural ceremonies, he asked why there were no crowds to meet him. They were all down on Pennsylvania Avenue, he was told, watching the suffrage parade.
Oh, goodness.
Interestingly, and rather sadly, the parade ended in chaos when it was broken up by a white mob with the police watching passively and doing nothing. There was a big investigation about it, and the U.S. Senate, a committee of the U.S. Senate, subcommittee of the U.S. Senate, investigated and issued a 600-page report giving the suffrage cause even more publicity. And as Paul hoped the episode and all the publicity just jump-started the constitutional amendment campaign again. So she accomplished what she wanted to do. Now, there are so many other suffragists and suffrage events over this 75-plus year history of the great movement to win the vote that could have been mentioned, including those who opposed it, who were called the Aunties.
Yeah.
The Aunties.
We had ours in Britain. The men, as I
They
said,
have a particular name?
What did I call them? What did they call them? It was the ones who had those 47,000 petitions. The Men's National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage. Okay. This was 1909. Okay. And interestingly, I read somewhere, I forgot to mention this to you, but quickly talking about advertising, getting the word out. I read somewhere that there was a rally in Madison Square Gardens around this time, maybe 1913, and I think Emmeline Penkhurst might have been there. And the tickets were $2.50 each, which I thought was really expensive.
It would have been at the time.
Yeah.
Fundraiser.
Yes. So, yes.
Yeah. Those who opposed the suffragist movement were called the Aunties, and those who support it were called the Suffs. So now I want to spend the last few minutes, and Angela may have something to say as well as Church in England, on the third word in our title, which was silence. There were thousands of supporters of the right of women to vote who were not involved in the movement at all, or who were not permitted to be involved by their husbands. So that is part of what we mean by silence. But I've been particularly interested in what I describe as the silence of the church. Where was the church in the suffrage movement? In general, I think from what I've been able to glean in my research, it's fair to say that most churches, whether local or regional or national organizations or denominations, opposed the movement for women's right to vote. And I think part of that opposition resulted from the conflating, coming together of societal norms of the time and conventional religious thought. Every possible negative stereotype applied with meanness was used to heap ridicule on the suffrage movement. Let me give you a couple examples and a quote. The women were called Amazons. Their meetings were called a petticoat revolution. An editorial in a Philadelphia newspaper at the time said this: "A woman is nobody, a wife is everything."
I read that somewhere too.
You read that too?
Yes. Behind
these insults, there were basic and widespread beliefs at the time about women and what role they should play. And you touched on this in England. Women's spear, if you want to call it that, was intended by God and nature to be thoroughly domestic and private, self-sacrificing and modest, and passive and deferential.
That's right. Where they said, that the women, the grubby world of politics would undermine the women's distinct strengths, which was their non-partisan, politically disinterested commitment to the public good.
It was a self-enclosed world, completely distinct from a man's world, where men pursued their ambitions and took action in the public arena of money-making, and politicking. Deviations from these roles, especially by women, were more than social gaffes. They were moral errors of the highest order. Here's a quote: "An unwomanly woman was a monster of nature and a threat to society." Preachers constantly denounce the movement and its goals using selective scripture verses for their reasoning. And I have to admit, you can find in both the Old and New Testaments scripture verses which, standing on their own, can be used to keep women in a certain well-defined place. But that's not the spirit of the New Testament, nor is it, in my view, the spirit reflected in the first chapter of the first book of the Old Testament, Genesis, the first book in the Bible. I'm going to quote verses 26, 27, and 28 of chapter 1 of Genesis. God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them, and God blessed them. And so there were many clergy and laity who supported the suffrage movement. The church was not of one mind, and I think that's the reason there was no, or at least that I could find, kind of a national campaign by any church to denounce the right of women to vote. And let me close my part with talking about our Episcopal Church in our contemporary time. On July 20th each year, the Episcopal Church commemorates 4 women who are designated on our church calendar as liberators and prophets. The first one listed is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the first one I talked about. The other 3 women, Amelia Bloomer, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Ross Tubman, were all involved in various reform movements of the 19th century, including other aspects of the women's movement that sought equality beyond just votes. And I think since World War II, the Episcopal Church has not been silent on social justice issues. And I think the collect for this July 20th commemoration of these liberators and prophets speaks to where the church is now. So let me read it to you, and we might use it as a prayer. O God, whose Spirit guides us into all truth and makes us free, strengthen and sustain us as you did your servants, Elizabeth, Amelia, Sojourner, and Harriet. Give us vision and courage to stand against oppression and injustice and all that works against the glorious liberty to which you call all your children. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.
Amen.
Amen. So, would you like to say anything more about England or whatever?
There's the quote that I read, and I'm not sure to whom I can attribute it, but they said, "We are here not because we are lawbreakers, we are here in our efforts to become lawmakers."
Oh, that's great.
And I think that's a great quote.
That's
and
a
I
great
think
quote.
that, Jesus certainly went to bat for women. And he certainly, one could say, it's an odd term, but I mean, he picked out women. He seemed to appreciate women who were strong.
Yeah.
He went out of his way to approach women or present them, such as the woman at the well,
Mm-hmm.
in a kind, spirited fashion.
That's right.
And I think the saddest thing about it all is just how brutal it all became. And that kind of draws a parallel to what's been happening again recently in the United States. And it's certainly happened at various times over the years in Great Britain and other places in the world. And it just speaks to how strongly people feel about it all, but it has to become so violent. It's a shame we can't find more peaceful ways to accomplish.
Yeah, that's especially true today in the United States. One thought I had as I researched and thought about this is that somehow in history there comes a time when it's a time to change. This happened in 1848 here in the United States with the Women's Suffrage Convention, and there was this Elizabeth Cady Stanton right there. And I thought, within the last few years, we've had the Me Too movement. Something needed to happen, and somebody stepped up and started it.
Right.
And that women are not going to put up anymore with sexual harassment of all kinds. And so it just seems to me that the times were ripe for change.
And you could say, I mean, it was a little longer in England from the time that Mary Smith stepped up in 1832 until 1928, when everybody could vote. But it's still, it's 96 years. And you could really say that in a way it hasn't finished yet.
No.
And that, and it's interesting the parallels, how thought, two countries so far apart in so many, geographically certainly.
Certainly, yeah.
And in the way the constitutions were set up, things like that. That they were sort of in the same mood.
Mm-hmm.
And it must have seemed like a grueling effort, and the years when they looked back themselves and thought, gosh,
Sure.
So and so did that 40 years ago and was still struggling to do this.
Well, we have enjoyed being with you this evening. I asked Angela, I didn't have to twist her arm much to do this. She has an interest in this. But remember now, this is an appetizer for you. You need to go back to the buffet and get a book or a video or do something and do your own research. There's so much to do.
And if anyone's particularly interested in paralleling the British movement, the National Archives in England and the British Library, there's some fantastic pictures and things. It's not always very easy to attribute them properly, so we apologize if we quoted perhaps the wrong person or gave you the wrong photo, but they were all in the fight.
They were all in the fight. So remember, formation opportunities are at 6:30 Monday through Friday. We hope you will come on Facebook Live to watch these. And also, we need to mention they're all archived. So if you didn't see something the first time, or if you want to go back and see one you saw, they're all there for you. We've enjoyed this evening. And so we'll say goodnight.
Say goodnight.
We'll say goodnight, and we hope to see you soon.